Okay, so my favorite swords. This list comes in two parts. One, my top 5 for aesthetic reasons, and 2, my top 5 for practical reasons. Those are different. And I'm only including swords that I've personally handled at one point or another. All except one of these are swords that I either own or used to own. So let's get to it. First off, my top 5 in terms of looks. Here's number 5. The Lockwood SL-1009, and I'll link all of these down below, by the way. I should point out something that not many of you may know, which is that medieval swords, for me, aesthetically, are an acquired taste. I used to not like them a whole lot, especially, straight double-edged swords with a simple crossguard like this. I used to find rather boring. I mean, it's not the most elaborate shape, obviously. It's rather simple, basic, but they've grown on me in recent years and I can appreciate them more. This one made it on the list because of how elegant it looks overall. It's a very slender sword, a nice slim blade, tapers a lot. This is really mainly for thrusting. And it also has a very fine crossguard. This is one of the thinnest crossguards I've seen. And the crossguard and pommel are blackened. I'm a big fan of dark hilt furnishings. It just looks great to me. And the grip is dark green, which is my favorite color. It's also nicely shaped. The way it tapers here just looks really good. Disc pommels are usually not that much up my alley, but this one still is nicely shaped. It's got the hollow inner circle, if you will, and yeah, it's just a gorgeous looking sword. Number 4 was a difficult one. I wanted to include a bronze sword, and I found it really difficult to decide between these two, the Ewart Park and the Khopesh. These are both bronze swords made by Neil Burridge. Ultimately, I gave it to the Ewart Park because it just overall looks nicer with its mirror polish. The Khopesh has a more basic, rougher finish. And this one also has a better fitted grip that overall looks a little more nicely made. But I do prefer the shape of the Khopesh, so it was a close one. Bronze is such a nice material and very corrosion resistant too. If you find an old iron sword on the ground, chances are it's largely eaten by rust and heavily corroded. A bronze sword, on the other hand, well, what happened is it turned green, it developed a patina. But if you were to polish it, you could restore it to its original condition quite easily. So these last pretty much indefinitely. And if you just leave it to itself without oiling and polishing it frequently, it's not a good idea to do that with iron or steel because they will rust. But this just turns darker first before it starts to turn green, which it's just really nice. They age very well. And, with how shiny it is, if you bring it to a good polish, there's really something fascinating about it. Number 4 is, I imagine no surprise, the Albion Caithness. It's not on my practical top 5 list because it's not a very good cutter and there are other swords on that list that perform better. But visually, I like it quite a lot. It's got the claymore style upswept guard, and there is also this point here or triangle shape on the guard, which I like a lot. The Lockwood has that too, by the way, in case you didn't notice. The grip is also dark green, which again is a huge plus. And of course, it flips you the bird. How can you argue with that, right? There's just, okay, the pommel is a bit weird. It's not necessarily the prettiest thing in the world, but I've come to like it, and it's just overall looks pretty damn good. Well, I try to avoid ties, but in this case I just couldn't, so these two will have to share number 2. This is the Sinclair Hilt Saber by Nielo Swords, and this is the Town Guard Side Sword by Arms and Armor. There are things I prefer about this one and things I prefer about the other one. The grip is among the things I really like about the Sinclair hilt, because it's got this nice contrast between the brass wire wrap and the black leather. That looks really nice. It also feels very good. The blade, I think I also prefer on this one. The triple fuller looks great. On the Town Guard, the wire wrap is also very nice. It just doesn't feel quite as good as the other one and doesn't have as much contrast. But on this one, I prefer the shape of the complex hilt, especially this side. I very much like how this looks. This bar here is nice and wide. That curvature looks really good. And also here, the way it splits into 3 bars, it just looks really, really nice. The other one is great too, but there's something about this that I like even more. Also the thinner ricasso here looks good. Just a lot of things that I very much appreciate about this. Also the surface finish on the Town Guard is superior to the Sinclair hilt. That one has some cosmetic flaws. This one here is really clean, and yeah, it's just a great looking side sword. The pommel is not quite my thing. I call it the tea infuser pommel. I don't know, not quite my shape, but otherwise still really nice. So what could be number 1 for me? I can already tell you, you won't guess it. It's not a European sword. It's probably not something that you would associate with my taste, or something that you've probably even seen on my channel, even though there are some really, really ancient, cringy videos of it, or at least one. So that's the Kris from Traditional Filipino Weapons. I think it was the Kris number 3. This one I don't have anymore. I sold it at one point because I needed money, which I would kind of like to have that again. In fact, I may just purchase it again now when I can. But this is a really beautiful sword. So for one, you have the Wavy Blade, which I find aesthetically extremely appealing. And those are hard to find. There are really few swords with a Wavy Blade. In terms of practical advantage, I'm not sure if it really makes much of a difference. At some point I would like to do some tests. It may or may not slice better, but regardless, I just find it looks good. And also the grip, the way that's shaped, it's both comfortable and looks good. The guard too is really a piece of art. And from what I understand, the way it's shaped is really more with regards to ceremonial and artistic considerations than practical function. I mean, it would of course serve a practical function in combat, but that's not really the main concern here. And especially with those brass accents as well on the guard, looks gorgeous. That's all I can say, really. It's a very pretty, artistically appealing sword, and it also cut very well. Now onto my top 5 in terms of performance. Here is one that almost made it on the list, the Albion Berserker. So this is an honorable mention, you could say. This cuts extremely well. It handles well. It's really the only reason why it didn't make it on the list is the pommel. This is not a particularly comfortable pommel. So that's really the only reason. There is another one that is somewhat similar that also has a very large pommel that's on my list, but it just doesn't bother me quite as much as this one. So that's why it didn't make it, but almost. Here's number 5, the Renaissance longsword by Michael Tinker Pierce. I've made a video about this, talking about how beautifully it handles and how well it cuts and all of that, how precisely it cuts. And yeah, I'm not going to repeat all of that. It is just an extremely well-designed sword. From the balance to the vibrational notes, you can tell that this is expertly crafted, and it performs so nicely. It held up extremely well, and yeah, it's just a pleasure to use, really, for cutting tests. Also looks nice with these additional bars here. Number 4 is this Dao or Chinese saber from Huanuo Forge. This is Kara saber. And this thing, well, it makes cutting easy. It slices really well. It's got a very nice blade geometry, flat grind, very fine edge, extremely sharp. It's lightweight. It handles really nicely. And this is easier to cut with than most of my straight double-edged swords, simply because it's more forgiving in the edge alignment. If it's slightly off, it'll still slice through. This one also almost made it on my top 5 aesthetic list. Basically, I think if it had an S-shaped guard, it would be on my list, because that would be more up my alley. But either way, the ornamented bronze fittings look extremely good. It's overall quite a handsome piece. Number 3 is the Albion Gaddhjalt. Now, this one wouldn't win a beauty contest for me personally, because I don't really like the shape of the Brazil nut pommel. It's just not my personal taste, and also very simple crossguard. But this is very convincing in terms of performance, because it cuts extremely well, it handles nicely, it's got a very long blade for a one-handed sword, and it also stands up to all kinds of abuse. I put up a video of that, and you can really go crazy with this, and it takes it all in a stride, no problem. Also, the blade gets very thin towards the point. There's a lot of distal taper. So even though something like the Dao is better at slicing, this is still really good at cutting because it is so thin, so it penetrates pretty easily. This would be better against hard materials like a wooden shield or bone, whereas the Dao slices better but doesn't deal with hard material quite as well. Number 2 is the Albion Principe, which I don't own. I had a chance to do some tatami cutting with it at Blood and Iron. It's their cutting sword, and wow, it is extremely impressive. At first, when looking at a picture, I totally underestimated it, but it cuts beautifully. It is amazing how easily it just blasts right through the mat as if it wasn't there. It's also remarkably well balanced, and the grip feels really good in the hand. And number 1, I don't think this will surprise anybody who has followed my channel for any length of time, the Albion Knecht. Obviously, it's the most high-end sword I have. It is just outstanding in design and performance. It cuts beautifully. It feels really good. It handles great. It takes a bunch of abuse without a problem. Very high quality materials, etc., etc. I've rambled about that often enough. And this did not make it on my top 5 aesthetic list, even though I do like the design, but it's just not quite as nice as some of the other ones. And I personally associate this kind of handle with like a steak knife or a bread knife. It's it's not the prettiest thing in that way. It feels really good, but overall it's really more of a utilitarian kind of aesthetic. It's not among the prettiest swords that I've handled, but I cannot argue with how expertly it's made, how well it handles, and how nicely it cuts. So pretty easy first place. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this double top 5 list. It may be subject to change in the future. If it does, I might do an update video. But until then, thanks for watching and enjoy your day.